What's going on YouTube? In today's video we're gonna take a look at how to work with the dropdowns. So this guy's over here, we have a couple of dropdowns on this Travelocity website. This is what we're gonna use for today's tutorial. I'm gonna show you how to create a module representation for each of these dropdowns. So what that means is we'll only need one object, and that one object will be able to represent each one of those dropdowns. That one object is going to have the ability to click on the dropdown, select a value from here, and then you will be able to call a method in that object to actually retrieve a selected value that's currently selected, and then you'll also be able to retrieve all of the available values that like this or this or this drop down has available for selection. One thing I want to mention is if we go into inspect view here and we take a look at the available selectors that we have for this particular drop down. So we're looking at rooms right now. So rooms has an ID. Now if we look at children here, children also has an ID. And all of these drop downs actually have an ID, and it's a unique ID. So the developers for Travelocity, when they designed this this page, they did a good job by putting the IDs in here. This is really good design. Now another good design that you can see from here is that their selections are right under their select element. So these options are right under their select element. I've seen page designs or element designs or component designs for dropdowns where you have your select, but then the options for that select are going to be somewhere outside of it, and that's a really bad design. But there are things like that that will impact the way you actually create the support for these dropdowns. Now with this design, this is actually going to be very straightforward. So let's go ahead and code this up. So I'm going to bring my PyCharm over here, and we're going to create a new Python file. We'll call this Dropdown tutorial, just to stay within the scheme of things. And then inside here we'll create a class, we'll call it Dropdown. Okay, call it Dropdown. Then let's define our init. Now our init is actually going to take a driver object and a Dropdown ID. Now this may differ depending on the design of the web elements on your application, on your website, depending on how your developers actually implemented and wrote the code, how the structure looks. So for this example, ID is all I need, and the driver I can't pass in because I'm not actually doing like a whole page objects schema here, so I'll actually be passing in the driver manually to this class, just to kind of keep things simple. So but like instead of ID, like for example, maybe I didn't have an ID on that page but maybe there is something unique in the class that would distinguish one drop down from another drop down, or maybe there is a name or something, some HTML property that distinguishes one dropdown from another dropdown. That's what you would put in here essentially. So now I want to actually store the driver inside this class. So I have a reference. So we're going to create a self. Basically, this is self means instance variable. So anytime dropdown instantiated, it's going to have a driver link inside of it. So it's always going to be unique. No matter how many dropdown objects you instantiate, each one of them will have its own unique driver associated with it. So now another thing I want to store is the dropdown ID that we pass in. So basically just assign that there, and then the next thing we'll actually store, we'll create an object of the element for the dropdown itself, and we'll reference a driver to find element by ID in this case, because we're passing in the dropdown ID. So we'll just do it this way. So now basically we have the bare minimum that we need to start working with the dropdown. So as I said, we're going to have multiple methods. We're going to have a select method, which is going to like select the value from the dropdown. We're going to have get selected method that's going to actually return some data about what is currently being selected, and then we can check if something is selected, that will return as true or false, or get available selections that will return us like all of the available values that we have for any given dropdown. So let's go ahead and start creating those methods. So the first one is the select method, and this method is going to choose a value in the dropdown. So we need to pass in a value to this method. Now, when we start working with the dropdown, right? So we open this page, and then before we can actually select any value from here, we actually need to click this dropdown. So the way we can do it is we can actually reference our dropdown object, and we can say click on that object, right? Because we already found this object, and this object is going to stay the same for this particular dropdown with this particular dropdown ID. So we're going to execute click on it. That's going to open all the values for us, and then we can reference or use our driver to find the element that we need to click next, which is going to be the value that we passed in. And because the value that we're passing in is actually going to be dynamic, in this case I like to do I like to use XPath, but it's up to you what you prefer. You can use CSS, I guess, CSS XPath, depending which one you think is faster. I just kind of stuck with XPath. So we're going to say select element by XPath, and then we're going to pass in our XPath in here. So let's take a look at the XPath real quick here. So if I open this and I do inspect on this element, let me just open my XPath helper here. So let's find this select element. So it found a bunch. I'm actually looking for this one. So I'm just going to paste that in. So there we go. Found that one. And this has some option. Okay, options. So now I need to click something. So you guys see what we're doing here, right? We found this this element, this particular drop down. This is the XPath for this drop down. But now we need to locate the specific element that we want to click. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go one down, right? We're gonna do /one down, and then we're looking for option tag, and it actually found 3 of them. Now we need to remember, in this function over here we're actually passing in the value. So the value that we're going to be passing in this case is going to be 1, 2, or 3, probably, maybe something else. It can be something else because in here it could be first class, premium, economy. So it has to be text, essentially, is what we're passing in. And you can see that the structure of this drop downs is actually the same across the board, meaning if I actually do inspect on this guy and I copy the ID for this dude, it's gonna find the selections for this particular drop down here. Now what that means is the only thing I need here is the text, right? The only thing I need here is the text. So if you go back to the previous rooms drop down, this is actually easy because I can say, okay, I want to select value number 2, so then it would actually find this number 2 with this XPath. So let me copy this XPath and go back to our code here, and I'm gonna just paste that in. Now a couple of things we need to replace here. We need to replace this 2 because this is a dynamic value, and we need to replace this ID as well because this is also going to be dynamic value depending on what's passed in here. So the way we're replacing them is we have this curly brackets in both places, and remember, this is text, this is not a number, so we do need quotes here, just FYI. So now we're going to do format on this, which allows us to place values inside those curly brackets. So the first thing we're going to place is the ID. So we're going to say Dropdown ID, and then we're going to place the value that we pass in from this to the method itself, right? This we pass in when we actually create the class for Dropdown, but this value we actually pass in when we call this method. So let me just do a new line here. So this actually completes our method. We'll actually just return self because we're not returning anything else. Once we complete this action, we can technically return self, so we have the ability to chain multiple actions if it makes sense to do so. So now let's create a method that will actually return us the selected value in the dropdown. So we'll just call it get selected. This particular method is not gonna take anything in. The only thing it's gonna do is it's actually just gonna return the value that we have, that the dropdown has selected. So we're gonna say self driver find element. Again, we're gonna use by XPath, and we're gonna use kind of similar XPath to this one, but I think the only thing we'll need to change is the option. The option that we're looking for has to be selected. So if you look over here at the options that we have, one of them, that one, has this selected property. If you change it to like 3, okay. So actually TryVelocity has a bug with their code. I don't know if you noticed this, but here we have rooms, right? I actually didn't see this when I was starting to create this tutorial, but it actually doesn't update the properties of the HTML. So that's something I can't do anything about. This is something you would probably bring up to the developer and tell him to fix this, because this is not good when this is happening. But basically we still have 1 as the selected value for this option. So instead of selecting, like changing this property to 2 in this case, because I just selected number 2, this should have been moved down to here. But anyway, we'll continue on with the tutorial. So actually, let's go back for a second. So the point I was trying to make here is when we creating the XPath, we need to look for a property selected. Okay, so we just need to make sure that that property is there. It doesn't matter what it equals to, because it's going to be present only in one of these elements, and whichever one has it means that's the one that's selected. So we'll just copy this. Or technically we don't even need to copy. So we'll put that in, and we're going to return text for this guy. Now when we're actually getting text with Selenium, it's going to return a Unicode object to us. So if you want to, you can convert this to a string, so it's not Unicode. You don't have to do that, but it's an option. So then the next method that we're going to have is we're going to check if certain value is selected in a dropdown. And here again, we'll actually pass in a value because we need to check our value against whatever is being selected. So this particular method is actually going to return true or false, whether something is being selected. So this is very easy. We can actually build on what we have already created, right? And that's get selected. So we can say value equals self get selected, right? And what that's going to do for us is it's going to basically compare whether the value that we passed in equals to this selected value. And if it does, it's going to return true. So is selected is going to be true, and if it doesn't, it's going to return false. So pretty simple. Now this is going to be the last method, and it's going to be the one that's going to be the most complicated method in this class, but don't worry, it's not. It's actually pretty simple. It's just more complicated than all of the other ones that we have in here. So this one we'll call get available selections, and basically what this is going to do is it's just going to return a list of all of the available values that the dropdown has in the order that they appear in the dropdown. So we're going to create a variable to store the list, and we'll actually declare it as a list to begin with, and then we're going to create an XPath, just our basic XPath, because we're going to be reusing this XPath a few times. So I like to any values or strings that I reuse, I try to not copy paste. So I try to keep it in the variable and then reuse that variable as much as possible to kind of keep the code clean and maintainable. So just a good practice to do so. All right, so this particular XPath is basically just going to be this guy, but with an exception. We're just looking for one option, and we're going to put the ID in here. So we're going to do format, put ID in here. We already have the curly brackets there, so that's good. Now what I want to do is I actually want to count how many options we have, and if I remove this, let's see, some reason it doesn't want to get removed. Okay, if I remove that, we see that this particular dropdown has 3 different options available for that. Now, this dropdown here has 4 different options available for it. So I actually need to get each one of those options individually. So what I'm gonna do is first I'm gonna get the count. So I'm gonna say count equals to length, and we're gonna get length from the number of elements that we find by using the driver. So we're gonna say self.driver.find element by XPath. It's actually not going to be a single element, it's going to be elements. So we're going to find all of the elements with the given XPath, and the XPath is just this base XPath that we declared above. So that will give us a number, integer number, for how many options we have in the dropdown. So now what we're going to do is actually we're going to loop through the range of those numbers in the count. So if the count is 4, it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so 0, 1, 2, 3, that's 4 items in the dropdown. But the problem with this is if we look at number 1, dropdown number 1, right over here, the index starts at 1, it doesn't start at 0. And when we do a range, actually let me write out the loop first, because this may not actually make sense right now. So we're going to say for index in range of count, if we leave it this way, if you leave this like that, what's going to happen is it's going to come over here and it's going to look for option 0, and option 0 doesn't exist. It will find 1, 2, and 3, but number 4 it will never get to, and it's actually going to fail on the 0. So what we need to do over here is we need to make sure that the range starts from 1, and then we shift the count by 1 as well. Okay, so now it's not going to start at 0, it's going to start at 1. And now we can actually say data append. So we're going to append a new value to our data variable, and we're going to reference the driver to find that element by XPath again, and here we're going to use format to kind of place the values that we need in here. And basically we're going to place the XPath first, and then we're going to put the index in there. So what that does is it's basically going to put this value right in here, and then we're going to place the index right inside the curly brackets here. So our XPath is going to look somewhat like this. Right, we put the base XPath in, and then we put the index in this curly brackets to access each individual drop-down item in the drop-down. Now we need to remember we also need to get text from it, because otherwise it'll just append the object of the web element, and that's not what we need. We actually need text, so make sure to specify that. Now again, if we leave it this way, it's actually gonna return us the Unicode characters, but I'll actually leave it as is just to show you what I mean by Unicode. So then we're gonna do return of the data that we have here. And now let's go ahead and test this code implementation real fast. So we're going to say if main equals name, then we're going to run some code. So first thing I want to do is actually create the driver, because we'll need to pass that into our class. And then So I'm going to get the driver from WebDriver, and then I'm going to use Chrome. So let's actually import this. Selenium WebDriver, Chrome, and I'm going to get, so we're using Travelocity for this testing, so that's exactly what I'm going to get with this get method. I'm going to just paste that address in there. And now let's take a look at how many drop downs we have on this page. I'm just going to refresh it real fast because I think I messed up some HTML elements there. So on this page we have 1, 2, 3, 4 drop downs. The class that we created here is going to support all 4 of them. Okay, so let's start with rooms. Let's create drop down instance for rooms. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to say rooms equals drop down. We're going to pass in the driver to it, and then we're going to pass in the ID for rooms, which is going to be like that. Now we have 3 more. There's a drop down for adults and children. Okay, so change this to adults, children. Let's get the IDs for this drop downs real fast here. That's for adults. Get one for children. Paste it in. There we go. One last one for the preferred class. Okay, so I'll just paste that in there and rename this to preferred class. So now let's make sure our functions actually work. Let's just check all of them in one go, I guess. Well, at least 50% of things we will be able to check, I guess 75. So we're just going to create a list of drop-down objects that we have here, so we don't do much copy and pasting. And then we're going to loop through them. So for drop-down and drop-downs, and then we'll just print, we're going to say drop-down, let's say is selected, and we'll just randomly pass a value in here. I'm trying to understand why this is not working, and this is actually a wrong keyword. Alright, for drop down and drop downs, print drop down is selected, and the value for selected is 1. So then we're gonna print drop down. Actually, let's print selection first, get selected, and then we're gonna check whether it's 1 or not. Then let's do print drop down, get available selections, and see if that works. We can also do select, but let's wrap this into a try catch actually, so it doesn't fail our script. And the way we're gonna do it is just TryAccept, and here we'll print that value is not selectable in dropdown format. So here we'll just pass in the value inside and pass in the dropdown ID. So basically what this will do, this just kind of enhances our method slightly. Whenever we cannot select, technically you would actually raise an exception here, but I just don't want to fail this script. So that's why I'm just printing this out so you guys can see how it works. So then here we're gonna actually try to select something. Let's do 2. See if it might be able to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our code and see if it works. Okay, and there we go. Launches the browser. Launches the browser, doing something, and it's actually not able to find an element. Let's take a look where it's failing. Okay, so what's happening here? We actually haven't passed in. We haven't passed in the self Dropdown ID inside because we have the brackets here, but we weren't doing the format. So now it should work. Let's rerun it. There we go. Have the browser opening. Now it's doing something. Let's see if it's gonna outprint anything. Alright, there we go. So it actually wasn't able to select any of the values, I don't think. Did it actually select any values? Oh, it didn't select any values because we don't actually do a click on it. So let's add the click. But yeah, looks like it will work. Because technically it should have selected 1, right? 1 is what? 2. Yeah, it should select 2 everywhere. So there we go. And it's not able to select 2 in this last one, so it actually says value 2 is not selectable in Dropdown, and it tells us the Dropdown ID, which is corresponding to that particular ID. So one last point I want to make is about the Unicode characters that we see over here in the list. If you don't want to see it this way with the U, all you need to do is just convert this to a string, and that way when you run it, it'll actually be a proper string. See, it's nice clean list. So there we go. That wraps this tutorial up. It's actually a pretty long tutorial to cover dropdowns, but I tried to be as informative as possible because a lot of tutorials on how to do this don't actually explain stuff properly. And I tried to also show you a good design technique to use when developing support for different components. And basically a dropdown is a component of a page, right? So technically, assuming every single dropdown on Travelocity follows the same design pattern, this code that you just created can support any dropdown on this Travelocity website. Okay, and it took 30 minutes to do so. So technically this is a pretty short video to explain a thing like that. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you guys learned something new. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and share the video. Appreciate you guys. Take care.